It was 8:17 on a rainy Thursday evening when I heard my oldest son say the sentence that changed the way I saw my family forever. "Well, I can't take Mom. My guest room is already being renovated." There was a pause. Then my daughter answered. "I took care of her after her knee surgery 3 years ago. It's someone else's turn." Another pause. A nervous laugh. Then my youngest son spoke. "What if we split the cost of assisted living?" I stood frozen in the hallway outside the guest bedroom, one hand resting against the wall. They didn't know I was there. They didn't know I could hear every word. And they certainly didn't know that while they were arguing about who would have to take me in, I was listening from the next room. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 74 years old. And for 39 years, every major decision I made was for my children. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. It starts more than 5 decades earlier, in a tiny 2-bedroom house on Willow Street. Back when my life looked completely different. Back when I still believed sacrifice automatically created gratitude. I was 19 when I met Daniel. He was 23, worked as an apprentice electrician, and possessed the kind of confidence that made every room feel brighter. We were married 14 months later. We weren't wealthy. We weren't glamorous. But we were happy. For the first few years, life moved exactly the way we imagined. A starter home. A second-hand car. Weekend picnics. Plans. Dreams. Children. Our first child, Michael, arrived when I was 22. 3 years later came Rebecca. 4 years after that, Thomas. 3 children. 1 income. A mortgage. And more optimism than common sense. Looking back, those were the richest years of my life despite having almost no money. Daniel worked hard. I worked harder. We built something together. Then everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October. Daniel left for work at 6:12 a.m. At 9:47 a.m., 2 police officers knocked on my door. A truck driver had run a red light. The impact killed him instantly. Daniel was 36 years old. I was 32. Michael was 10. Rebecca was 7. Thomas was 3. I remember every detail of that day. The smell of coffee still sitting on the counter. The sound of Thomas playing with toy cars. The expression on the younger officer's face as he tried not to cry while telling me my husband was gone. What I don't remember is how I made it through the next 6 months. Because grief wasn't something I processed. It was something I postponed. There were children to feed. Bills to pay. A mortgage due in 19 days. The life insurance payout sounded large until reality arrived. After debts, taxes, funeral costs, and outstanding loans, there wasn't enough to support a family for very long. People offered advice. Lots of advice. Sell the house. Move in with relatives. Remarry. Start over. I ignored all of it. Not because I was brave. Because I was stubborn. I wanted my children to grow up in the home they knew. I wanted stability. I wanted them to keep their schools. Their bedrooms. Their routines. So I worked. Then I worked more. And then I worked even more. By age 35 I had 3 jobs. Morning receptionist. Afternoon bookkeeping. Weekend cleaning work. On average, I slept 5 hours a night for nearly 11 years. I missed birthday parties. School events. Vacations. Friendships. Relationships. Everything. Not because I didn't love those things. Because survival required choices. And every choice favored my children. People often romanticize single motherhood. They shouldn't. There was nothing romantic about sitting at the kitchen table at 1 00 a.m. trying to decide whether the electricity bill or the car payment could wait another week. Nothing romantic about eating cereal for dinner so your children could have proper meals. Nothing romantic about pretending not to be sick because missing work wasn't an option. The strange thing is that my children never really saw those decisions. Children rarely do. What they saw was a mother who was always busy, always tired, always saying no. No to expensive field trips. No to designer clothes. No to unnecessary spending. No to things other families seemed able to afford. And slowly, over time, they developed a story about me. A story that wasn't completely wrong, but wasn't completely right either. The story was simple. Mom works hard. Mom worries. Mom sacrifices. That's just who she is. Like gravity. Permanent. Guaranteed. Automatic. I should have recognized the danger of that assumption much earlier. The first warning came when Michael was 12. His friend Jason invited him to a ski trip. The cost was $240. At the time, $240 might as well have been $24,000. I explained gently that we couldn't afford it. Michael didn't yell. He didn't cry. He simply shrugged and said something that stayed with me for decades. Other moms find a way. He wasn't trying to hurt me. That's what made it hurt. Because children tell the truth as they understand it. And his truth was that my efforts were invisible compared to what I couldn't provide. Years later, that moment would repeat itself in different forms. Different voices, different situations, same lesson. People often notice absence more than sacrifice. Michael grew into a practical man. An accountant. Brilliant with numbers. Careful. Efficient. Logical. He viewed life as a series of responsibilities that needed managing. Rebecca became a corporate attorney. Ambitious. Disciplined. Focused. She believed success came from relentless effort because she had watched me survive through relentless effort. Thomas became a technology consultant. Creative. Charming. Adaptable. The most emotionally expressive of the three. Each inherited something from me. But they inherited different pieces. And somewhere along the way, they also inherited another belief. That I would always be okay. Because I always had been. What none of them fully understood was that resilience has a cost. A person can survive difficult decades. That doesn't mean those decades leave no scars. By the time Michael graduated college, I had paid for every tuition bill I could manage. By the time Rebecca finished law school, I had refinanced the house twice. By the time Thomas launched his first business, I had emptied nearly every savings account I possessed. I never regretted it. Not once. But every dollar I invested in their futures was a dollar not invested in my own. Friends traveled. I worked. Friends retired. I worked. Friends built hobbies. I worked. Friends found companionship. I worked. Life became a tunnel with one destination. Get the children established. Everything else can wait. Then one day the children were established. And I looked around. The tunnel was over. But the years were gone. Michael married Claire. Rebecca married Jonathan. Thomas married Emily. Grandchildren arrived. Holidays became larger. Louder. Busier. And for a while, I genuinely believed I had reached the reward phase of life. The season where sacrifices become memories. The season where family gathers because they want to. The season where love comes back around. I wasn't expecting luxury. I wasn't expecting repayment. I was simply expecting belonging. The signs that something was wrong appeared gradually. Too gradually. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. Schedules became more important than relationships. Nobody was cruel. That would have been easier. Cruelty is obvious. Neglect is subtle. Neglect arrives disguised as busyness. Years passed. I became the family member everyone loved. And nobody prioritized. There is a difference. A significant difference. At 68, I needed knee replacement surgery. Recovery required assistance for 8 weeks. The discussion among my children sounded surprisingly similar to the conversation I would overhear years later. Who had space? Who had time? Who had flexibility? Who had already helped recently? Eventually, Rebecca agreed. And to her credit, she cared for me well. But I noticed something. Every favor had become a calculation. Every act of support carried an invisible ledger. People weren't asking what Mum needed. They were asking whose turn it was. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself families get busy. I told myself expectations create disappointment. So I lowered mine. Then lowered them again. And again. Until eventually I expected almost nothing. The strange thing about expecting nothing is that people still find ways to disappoint you. At 73, my doctor recommended I stop living alone. Not immediately, but eventually. My balance wasn't what it once had been. My arthritis was progressing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent. Just reality. I shared the information with my children. They nodded. They expressed concern. They promised we'd figure something out. Months passed. Nothing happened. Then came the family gathering where everything changed. Michael hosted Thanksgiving that year. 21 people attended. Children running everywhere. Football on television. Turkey in the ovens. The kind of gathering that looks perfect in photographs. The conversation about my future began after dinner. I wasn't supposed to hear it. I had gone upstairs to rest. At least that's what everyone thought. Instead, I returned downstairs looking for my reading glasses. And accidentally overheard the meeting. A meeting about me. Without me. Michael spoke first. I just don't think our house works. Rebecca replied immediately. My house isn't exactly set up either. Thomas sighed. What are we even talking about? She isn't helpless. Not yet, Rebecca answered. Not yet. 2 simple words. But they carried enormous weight. Not yet. As if I were a problem waiting to happen. An obligation approaching on the calendar. Something inevitable and inconvenient. Then the conversation continued. Room availability. Work schedules. Property values. School districts. Commute times. Retirement communities. Monthly costs. Practical considerations. Reasonable considerations. And somehow every reasonable consideration added up to something deeply unreasonable. Nobody asked what I wanted. Nobody asked how I felt. Nobody asked whether I was afraid. The discussion treated me like a logistical challenge. Not a mother. Not a person. A project. I stood there listening for nearly 14 minutes. 14 minutes. After 39 years of sacrifice. 14 minutes. And in those 14 minutes, something inside me changed. Not anger. Not bitterness. Clarity. Pure clarity. For the first time I saw the system. Not the incident. The pattern. My entire life I had solved problems before they reached my children. I had removed obstacles. Absorbed consequences. Provided safety. And because I had done it successfully, they unconsciously assumed I always would. The stronger I appeared, the less care I received. The more dependable I became, the more invisible my sacrifices became. That night I returned home alone. And I made a decision. A decision nobody saw coming. Including me. For the next 8 months, I told no one what I was doing. I met financial advisors, estate attorneys, retirement specialists, housing consultants. I reviewed every asset I owned. The house, investments, insurance policies, savings, land, everything. The total surprised even me. Because while I had sacrificed heavily, I had also worked continuously. Invested carefully. Saved consistently. By then my estate exceeded $2.8 million. Not enormous, but substantial. Especially for a woman everyone quietly assumed needed rescuing. I sold the family house. The house where my children grew up. The house I fought to keep after Daniel died. That decision shocked everyone. Mostly because I didn't ask permission. Then I purchased a residence in a senior living community 40 miles away. Not assisted living. Independent living. Beautiful grounds. Libraries. Walking paths. Fitness facilities. Classes. Friends. Life. Actual life. For the first time in decades, I built something exclusively for myself. And something remarkable happened. I became happy. Not occasionally happy. Consistently happy. I made friends. Real friends. I joined a book club. Started painting. Took history courses. Traveled. At 74, I experienced freedom I had never known at 24. My children seemed relieved. At first. Then confused. Because I stopped asking for things. Stopped needing things. Stopped centering my life around their availability. And people often become uncomfortable when someone no longer occupies the role they've assigned them. Then came the annual family reunion. The event that changed everything. The reunion was hosted at a lakeside resort. 37 family members attended. Children, spouses, grandchildren, cousins, everyone. On the second evening after dinner, my grandson Ethan approached me. He was 16. Observant. Kind. The kind of young man who notices details adults ignore. Grandma. Yes. Can I ask something? Of course. Why do Mom and Uncle Michael always talk like they're taking care of you? I laughed softly. What do you mean? He shrugged. They talk about you like you're dependent on them, but you don't seem dependent on anybody. Children. Sometimes they see everything. I smiled. That's an interesting observation. Then he said something I'll never forget. I think they still think you're the same person you were when they were kids. He was right. Exactly right. A few hours later, the family gathered in a banquet room. During dessert, a conversation began about future planning. Retirement. Inheritance. Caregiving. The usual topics. Then someone asked where I planned to live long term. Before I could answer, Michael responded. We're still figuring that out. We, not me. We. The room nodded. Assumptions layered upon assumptions. And suddenly I realized something. My children weren't malicious. They genuinely believed they were discussing my future. Because they had never fully considered that I might already have one. So I stood, smiled, and calmly corrected them. No, Michael, I'm not figuring it out. I already figured it out. Silence. Michael blinked. What do you mean? I mean I've spent the last year planning my future. Rebecca frowned. What future? The one I'm currently living. Maury silence. People exchanged glances. I explained the community. The activities. The friends, the travel plans, the volunteer work, the investments, the trust, the estate planning, everything. And for the first time in years, my children looked genuinely surprised. Not because they disagreed. Because they had no idea. Then came the moment nobody expected. My attorney, who happened to be attending the reunion because she was married to a distant cousin, joined the conversation. Pure coincidence. Or fate. I'm still not sure. Someone jokingly asked whether I had everything organized. My attorney laughed. Margaret is probably the most organized client I've ever had. The room chuckled. Then she added, honestly, most people half her age don't have their affairs managed as well as she does. The laughter faded. The statement landed. People began asking questions. And for the next hour, a very different version of my life emerged. The version nobody had noticed. The businesses I'd invested in. The charitable work I'd funded. The scholarships I'd established anonymously. The financial independence I'd built. The leadership roles I'd accepted. The life I'd created beyond motherhood. My children sat quietly. Listening. Learning. Possibly for the first time. They weren't discovering hidden wealth. They were discovering hidden personhood. And that realization affected each of them differently. Michael became thoughtful. Very thoughtful. He called me 3 days later. Not to discuss logistics. Not to discuss plans. To apologize. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just honestly. I think I stopped seeing you as an individual. For Michael, that was a profound admission. Rebecca reacted with guilt. Years of guilt. She examined conversations. Decisions. Assumptions. And eventually confessed something. I spent so much time respecting your strength that I forgot strength still needs appreciation. Thomas cried. Not immediately. Weeks later. During lunch. Halfway through a sandwich. Without warnings. Because sometimes realization arrives late. And when it does, it arrives all at once. The consequences weren't explosive. No family feud. No public humiliation. No dramatic revenge. Just awareness. And awareness changed everything. Phone calls became longer. Visits became intentional. Questions became personal. My children started asking what I wanted. Not what they planned. What I wanted. A subtle difference. A massive difference. The following year brought another surprise. The local community foundation honored me for philanthropic contributions. Nothing enormous. A modest recognition ceremony. Perhaps 80 people attended. What mattered wasn't the award. What mattered was who showed up. All 3 children. Every grandchild. Every spouse. Not because they felt obligated. Because they were proud. And during the reception I overheard something. This time accidentally. This time beautifully. A guest asked Michael what his mother had done professionally. Michael smiled. Then answered. Honestly, she did everything. Not everything. No one does everything. But I understood what he meant. For the first time, he saw the scale of a life he had previously viewed through a single lens. Mother, instead of person. Provider, instead of individual. Resource, instead of human being. That distinction changed our family. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But permanently. Today I'm 74. I live in a place I love. I have friends who know me beyond my family role. I have hobbies, plans, goals, and relationships with my children that are healthier than they've ever been. Because they're based on reality now. not assumptions. If there's a lesson in all this, it isn't about inheritance, or agging, or even family. It's about systems. Families create systems the same way companies create systems. The reliable person gets called first. The responsible person handles crises. The strong person absorbs pressure. And eventually, everyone forgets those roles are being performed by actual human beings. Not machines. Not institutions. People. The danger isn't cruelty. The danger is familiarity. When someone has always carried the weight, we stop noticing the weight exists. Until one day they put it down. And everyone finally sees how heavy it was. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt invisible because you were always the strong one in your family? Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. The funny thing about being seen for the first time at 74 is that it doesn't feel the way people imagine. It isn't dramatic. There are no orchestras playing in the background. No perfect speeches. No magical moment where decades of misunderstanding disappear. Instead, it happens quietly. In pieces. A phone call that lasts 20 minutes longer than usual. A question someone should have asked years ago. A visit that isn't connected. A year after that dinner, my 75th birthday arrived. For most of my life, birthdays had been practical events. A cake. A few presents. A phone call. Maybe dinner. Nothing elaborate. When you're raising children alone, birthdays become just another date on the calendar. You learn very quickly that survival doesn't pause for celebrations. So when Michael called and insisted everyone keep the second Saturday of September free, I didn't think much about it. I assumed it was a family lunch. Maybe a surprise gathering. Nothing more. The morning began normally. I watered the flowers on my balcony. Read 3 chapters of a history book. Had coffee with my friend Louise from the community centre. By noon I was getting ready when Rebecca called. Are you almost ready? Ready for what? She laughed. Just wear something nice. That should have been my first clue. When I arrived at the community event hall, I immediately realized something unusual was happening. Cars filled the parking lot. Far more cars than necessary for a simple family lunch. Then I walked inside. And stopped. Nearly 80 people were waiting. Family, friends, neighbors, former co-workers, people from my church, people from the retirement community, former students from my history classes, even a few people I hadn't seen in decades. The room erupted into applause. I stood frozen, completely speechless. For a woman who had spent most of her life unnoticed, being seen by 80 people at once was almost overwhelming. Then I noticed a banner hanging near the stage. It didn't say Happy Birthday. It said, CLEBOATING, The Life of Margaret Collins. Not the age. The life. That distinction mattered. Because for so many years my identity had been reduced to a role. Mother, widow, caretaker, provider. Now people were celebrating the entire story. The person behind those roles. The afternoon became a blur. Photos, laughter, stories, memories. Then Michael walked to the microphone. And suddenly the room became quiet. My oldest son looked nervous. Which was unusual. Michael was normally composed under pressure. But that day his hands shook slightly. I've spent most of my life believing I understood my mother. He paused. I was wrong. The room remained silent. When you're a child, your parents seem permanent. They seem larger than life. You don't realize they're making impossible decisions every day. He glanced toward me. Then continued. My mother buried her husband at 32 years old, and somehow managed to raise 3 children without letting us feel the full weight of what she carried. Several people nodded. A few wiped tears from their eyes. Michael took a breath. For years I thought strength was something people naturally possessed. His voice cracked slightly. Now I understand strength is usually something people choose repeatedly, when quitting would be easier. The room applauded. And for the first time in decades, I saw my son not as a successful accountant. Not as a husband. Not as a father. I saw him as the 10-year-old boy who lost his dad and spent years trying to understand why life changed so suddenly. Then Rebecca spoke. Unlike Michael, she didn't bring notes. She simply stood behind the microphone and looked at me. For several seconds she couldn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. I used to think Mom had no dreams. The room became even quieter. I know how terrible that sounds. A nervous laugh moved through the audience. But it's true. She smiled sadly. I thought she existed to help other people achieve their dreams. Her eyes filled with tears. And then one day I discovered she had sacrificed dreams of her own. The room remained silent. Not uncomfortable silence. Respectful silence. The kind that happens when people recognize honesty. Rebecca wiped her eyes. I spent years admiring her strength. She paused. Then I learned appreciation and admiration aren't the same thing. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone listened. Because everyone understood. Most people have someone in their life who quietly carries responsibilities without recognition. A parent, a spouse, a sibling, a friend. Someone whose contributions become so consistent that they stop attracting attention. Rebecca finally smiled. I'm grateful I figured it out before it was too late. That sentence hit harder than anything else said that afternoon. Before it was too late. How many people never get that opportunity? How many conversations never happen? How many apologies remain unspoken because everyone assumes there will always be more time? Then came Thomas. And everyone expected him to cry. Including Thomas. He laughed before he even reached the microphone. Let's just get this over with. The room laughed. I've already cried twice today. That only made people laugh harder. Then he looked directly at me. You know what I remember most from childhood? I shook my head. The sound of your keys. Confused smiles spread across the room. Thomas continued. I always knew exactly what time Mom got home because I could hear her keys at the front door. His voice softened. Sometimes she'd come home exhausted. A pause. Sometimes she'd come home worried. Another pause. Sometimes she'd come home sick. The room became still. But no matter what happened that day, she'd walk through the door smiling because she didn't want us to worry. Silence. The deep kind. The honest kind. Then he added, I don't think we appreciated how much love that required. Nobody applauded immediately. People simply sat there absorbing the truth. Then applause filled the room. Long, sincere, unforced. And suddenly I found myself crying. Not because of the speeches. Because of what they represented. Recognition. Not perfection. Recognition. Those are different things. Later that afternoon, people shared stories I had completely forgotten. Former co-workers described moments I barely remembered. Neighbors recalled acts of kindness I considered ordinary. Former students talked about classes that had changed their lives. One woman approached me carrying a folder. Inside were essays from students I'd taught during my first semester at the community college. Dozens of them. Apparently the coordinator had collected them. Many described how much the classes meant to them. Several mentioned finding confidence, purpose, curiosity. One sentence stood out. A student named Jennifer had written, Mrs. Collins teaches history like someone who understands that every life becomes history eventually. I read that line 3 times, because it captured something I had never been able to explain. Every life becomes history eventually. The question is whether people understand the story before it's over. That evening, after everyone left, I returned home exhausted. Happy, overwhelmed, grateful. And as I sat alone in my apartment, I found myself thinking about Daniel. As I often did. Not with sadness anymore. Just reflection. I wondered what he would think if he could see everything. The children. The grandchildren. The lives that continued after his ended. I wondered whether he'd be proud. I think he would. Not because everything turned out perfectly. Because it turned out honestly. Life isn't measured by perfection. It's measured by endurance. By growth. By what remains after difficult seasons pass. The next morning I discovered something unexpected. The celebration had sparked conversations throughout the family. Deep conversations. Important conversations. Conversations that should have happened years earlier. Grandchildren began asking their parents about sacrifices they'd made. Spouses began discussing unspoken burdens. Siblings started sharing responsibilities more intentionally. The ripple effect surprised everyone. One family celebration had become a mirror. People started examining their own relationships, their own assumptions, their own blind spots. And that's the strange thing about recognition. When done sincerely, it spreads. People who feel seen become better at seeing others. Months later, Ethan visited again. By then he was preparing for college. Tall, confident, thoughtful. We sat beside the lake one evening watching the water reflect the sunset. And after a long silence he asked, "Grandma, are you ever angry?" I considered the question. Then smiled. About what? The way things happened. Interesting question. One I'd asked myself many times. Was I angry? Years earlier, perhaps. Hurt, certainly. Disappointed, absolutely. But anger? Not anymore. Finally, I answered. No, really. Really. Why not? I watched a group of ducks cross the water. Then I said, because understanding is more useful than anger. He waited. So I continued. If I stayed angry, I'd only learn half the lesson. What do you mean? I understand what my children failed to see. A pause. But I also understand why they failed to see it. That distinction mattered. A lot. People don't always ignore sacrifices because they don't care. Sometimes they ignore sacrifices because those sacrifices become normal. Expected. Part of the background. Like air conditioning. Electricity. Running water. You only notice them when they disappear. The challenge is learning to notice them before that happens. Ethan thought about this for a while. Then he nodded. I think that's why everyone changed. What do you mean? They finally saw you. Simple. Accurate. True. Several months later, another milestone arrived. The community college offered me a permanent part-time position. At 76 years old. A career beginning at an age when most people expected me to be slowing down. Life has a sense of humor sometimes. I accepted immediately. Not because I needed the money. Because I loved the work. Loved the students. Loved the feeling of contributing something meaningful. The first day of the new semester, I stood in front of a classroom filled with 47 students. Some were 18. Some were 68. Some were returning to education after decades away. Others were beginning for the first time. As I looked around the room, I felt something unexpected. Not pride. Completion. as though a circle that began when I was 18 had finally closed. Not perfectly, not directly, but completely. After class ended, I walked outside into the autumn sunlight. And my phone buzzed. A message from Michael. A family group chat. 3 words. Love you, Moms. A second message appeared from Rebecca. Proud of you. Then Thomas. History professor, who would have guessed. I laughed out loud standing there on the sidewalk. Several students looked at me curiously. I didn't care. Because at that moment I understood something important. The greatest victory wasn't financial independence. It wasn't the retirement community. It wasn't the speeches. It wasn't even the recognition. The greatest victory was this. My children no longer saw me as someone whose story was ending. They saw me as someone whose story was still being written. And honestly, so did I. For decades, I believed my purpose was raising children. Then I believed my purpose was helping grandchildren. Now I understand something different. Purpose isn't a single role. It's a series of chapters. And every time we think the book is finished, life quietly turns another page. Looking back, I no longer focus on the night I overheard my children arguing about who would have to take me in. That moment mattered. But it wasn't the ending. It was the beginning. The moment when everyone, including me, finally realized that the woman in the next room wasn't waiting to be taken care of. She was still becoming who she was meant to be. 2 years later, on a cold January morning, I found myself standing in front of a mirror wearing a navy blue blazer and wondering how exactly life had become so strange. At 77 years old, I was preparing for a television interview. Nothing national. Nothing glamorous. A regional public broadcasting station had decided to feature several local educators who had started second careers later in life. Apparently, becoming a history instructor after 70 was unusual enough to attract attention. I still wasn't completely comfortable with that idea. For most of my life, attention had belonged to other people. Children, employers, customers, managers, community leaders. I had spent decades standing slightly off to the side, doing the work, helping things function, making sure everyone else had what they needed. Now people wanted to hear my story. Even after all this time, that felt strange. The interview itself lasted less than 30 minutes. The host was kind, curious, prepared. Near the end, she asked a question I had heard many times before. What advice would you give people who feel it's too late to start something new? The answer came immediately. Because I had lived it. It's only too late for the life you imagined. She looked intrigued. So I continued. But life rarely follows the original blueprint. A pause. The mistake people make is believing that if plan A disappears, happiness disappears with it. The host nodded. What happens instead? I smiled. Sometimes plan D turns out better than plan A. The interview aired 3 weeks later. I forgot about it almost immediately. Then something unexpected happened. Letters started arriving. Actual letters. Handwritten letters. Some came from retired people. Others from widows. Single parents. Former caregivers. People who had spent years putting everyone else first. Many shared similar stories. Dreams delayed. Goals abandoned. Identities swallowed by responsibilities. One letter came from a woman in Arizona. She was 72. For 40 years she had cared for family members. Parents, children, then a husband with dementia. After watching the interview, she enrolled in an art program. Another letter came from a man who started learning piano at 68. Another from a grandmother beginning college at 71. I read every single one. Because they reminded me of something important. My story wasn't unique. Specific details were unique. But the pattern wasn't. Millions of people spend decades carrying responsibilities. And somewhere along the way, they forget they're allowed to have futures too. That spring brought another unexpected development. Ethan graduated high school. I sat in the front row beside Michael and Claire. Watching him cross the stage. Watching him become an adult. And as I applauded, a strange memory surfaced. Michael at 18. Rebecca at 18. Thomas at 18. Suddenly 50 years felt like 5 minutes. Time works that way sometimes. Slow while you're living it. Fast once it's gone. After the ceremony, families gathered on the football field for photographs. Parents cried. Grandparents smiled. Teenagers pretended not to be embarrassed. The usual rituals. Then Ethan walked directly toward me. Not his parents. Not his friends. Me. He wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "You know what I'm studying." I smiled. History. He grinned. History. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he added, "Funny how that happened." I laughed. Very funny. Because life occasionally writes endings better than fiction. The dream I never pursued had somehow reached the next generation. Not through pressure. Not through expectation. Through example. Weeks later, Ethan asked if he could interview me for a university project. The assignment involved documenting family history. Of course I agreed. I assumed it would take an hour. Maybe 2. Instead it became a series of conversations lasting nearly 3 months. He asked everything. Childhood memories. Marriage. Widowhood. Work. Parenting. Mistakes. Regrets. Successes. Failures. Every chapter. One afternoon he asked a question that stopped me completely. What accomplishment are you most proud of? I expected an easy answer. Raising children. Surviving hardship. Teaching. Something obvious. Instead, I found myself thinking for a very long time. Finally, I answered. Learning who I was after everyone stopped needing me. He lowered his notebook. Surprised. Really? Really? More than raising your family? I nodded. Because raising a family was a responsibility. A pause. Rediscovering myself was a choice. He thought about that. Then slowly wrote it down. I hoped he understood. Most people spend years building identities around being needed. Parent. Employee. Provider. Caretaker. Leader. But eventually those roles change. Children grow up. Jobs end. People move away. Retirement arrives. And when that happens, many people face a frightening question. Who am I when nobody needs me today? For years, that question terrified me. Now it fascinated me. Because the answer kept evolving. At 78, I wasn't the same woman I had been at 74. Or 64. Or 44. Growth hadn't stopped. It had simply changed direction. That realization became even more important when health problems finally arrived. Nothing catastrophic. Just age. Arthritis worsened. Energy decreased. A few additional medications appeared. Reality. One afternoon my doctor reviewed test results and smiled gently. You're doing well. The phrase made me laugh. At 78, doing well means something different than it did at 28. No one expects perfection. The goal becomes maintenance. Stability. Quality of life. After the appointment, I called Rebecca. Not because I needed help. Because I wanted to share the update. That simple distinction still felt remarkable. Years earlier, health conversations centered around concern. Now they centered around connection. She listened carefully, asked questions, then casually said, "I'm proud of how you've handled agging." The statement surprised me. Proud? Yes. Why? Rebecca didn't hesitate. Because you've treated it like another stage of life instead of the end of life. I thought about that afterward. And perhaps she was right. Many people spend decades fearing old age. As if agging automatically erases purpose. But purpose isn't attached to youth. It's attached to engagement, curiosity, participation. As long as those things remain, life remains. The following autumn, the community college held an annual awards banquet. I attended mostly out of obligation. Faculty were encouraged to participate. I expected speeches, certificates, chicken dinners, nothing more. Instead, halfway through the evening, the dean stepped onto the stage and announced a new recognition award. The Margaret Collins Lifelong Learning Award. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard. The room applauded. People stood. Students cheered. And I sat there completely stunned. Apparently, several colleagues had nominated me. Former students wrote letters. Community members submitted recommendations. The award would be given annually to individuals who pursued education later in life. When they invited me to the stage, I barely remembered how to walk. The applause lasted longer than seemed possible. And as I looked out across the room, I noticed something. Michael, Rebecca, Thomas, all standing, all applauding. Not because I was their mother. Because they respected what I had become. That distinction mattered. A lot. After the ceremony, Thomas hugged me. Then laughed. "You know, this is getting ridiculous." "What is?" "You keep having more."